Hi everybody. In today's lab, we're going to learn how to create visualizations from the General Social Survey Data Explorer. You're going to learn a little bit about the General Social Survey, which is an ongoing study, and do a few activities related to it to help get you oriented with the lab. All of the materials uh, for the lab are in Blackboard, of course, in the lab tab, the data lab tab, and then we're in lab 1, describe data from the GSS. You should be able to see your lab 1 report. This is where you'll submit your lab assignment, and the attached lab guide has the guidelines for completing the whole lab, and you'll complete a lab report as part of doing the various activities in the lab. Let's take a quick look at the guide for this week's lab. So as you can see, I've laid it out step by step, and it's helpful if you go through and do it in the orders indicated, because the assignment itself is made to build on the earlier steps. So the first step you're doing right now, watch the lecture video, and I'll give you an overview of the assignment and some of the key terms that you're gonna need to complete your lab report. The next major step, and that you'll do and we'll do in our time here, is familiarize yourself with the GSS Data Explorer. So I provided a link to the GSS Data Explorer here. It's also lab 1 folder. So yeah, either way, I've already got it open over here. And as you can see, the Data Explorer has a interesting interface here, and this takes you right to the overview for the Data Explorer itself. Now, to help you understand a little bit of what's going on back here, I've asked, what is the GSS? What does this survey do generally, and how is this administered over time? I'd like you to review the home page for the GSS Explorer, and then the About section of the website. You can find the link up here, and the content of these pages, and the key points about the construction of the survey and its funding purposes, etc., will be covered in the following quiz, the Lab 1 GSS quiz. Now, the quiz is nothing to be too scared about. It'll be pretty easy as long as you just read through the pages indicated and familiarize yourself a little bit with the GSS data. It's good to read the About section and get an idea of how does this GSS Data Explorer work. We're going to use the Data Explorer again in the future. So you're not just orienting yourself to this tool for today's lab, but for future labs. And this is a tool that you can use in the future indefinitely. The GSS is a very popular data set. It's one of the most frequently analyzed population data sets, period. It's analyzed for all kinds of purposes, and it's been administered for a very long time, since 1972. So there's a lot of really valuable information there, and they collect data across a wide range of topics. And as part of the features in the Data Explorer, they have provided the key trends. This new key trends section identifies some major areas in the survey and it groups them into the following categories here. And you can see they give you 5 major categories, but within that, you would select a trend of interest. And actually for the lab, you'll select 4 trends of interest. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. So the trends, as you can see, go across a broad range of areas of social interest, and the topics that are available in any of these trend areas are the questions that are asked on the survey. And so when you go in and explore a trend, let's do that now. You can see I selected the gender and marriage trend, and you need to select some trends for your assignment, but don't select the same trend that I have. But today I'm going to do, I usually try to do something boring in the examples so I can leave the fun stuff for you all. So I'll stick with number of children. And let me help you understand what's happening in this table. So we looked at trends for gender and marriage, but we said, but there's a lot of different outcome variables available in the gender and marriage area. And so as you can see, I went to this, it defaulted to the number of children variable because that was the first one on the list. But you can easily change this outcome variable by clicking the drop-down menu, and you can see there are many different variables available. Select one of interest to you, and the table will repopulate with the data from that variable. Now, in order to get a full picture of what is going on in the variable, you can look at the question response category, so you can see how the variable was measured and what the levels of the variable are. And then in the breakdown, and this is where it gets really fun, because you might be thinking, this is pretty boring, what's the point here? Well, in the breakdown section, you can take your outcome variable and select a predictor variable to break down these results by. So first, we're seeing just number of children, and this is currently we're just seeing the total. But if I'd like to break down number of children using a predictor, I'll select condition of health. So now I have a much more interesting dynamic or a dynamic visualization to use the GSS Data Explorer title for this whole interface we're using right now. They call these dynamic visualizations. So when you see that referenced on the site, this is what they're talking about. And we can see on our figure here about number of children that so that it's broken down in terms of the predictor, which I selected condition of health. So my predictor has 4 categories. They are listed here in the breakdown category, and the 4 levels for condition of health are excellent, good, fair, and poor. And you can see how they're across the graph. And what we're looking at right now is the number of children, right? And then, but if we change oh, great. Just my luck. this week. So that's the appropriate response if it goes wrong for you too. Just laugh, start again. If you have continued problems with one variable, try a different variable. I'll go ahead and do that right now since I don't want to spend our time on the video troubleshooting. But as you can see, stuff happens. Thanks, technology. It's a double-edged sword. Let's go with I'll save those gender and marriage categories for you, and let's switch to a civil liberty. Sounds good. And as you can see, for each area, there's a variety of questions. And when you use the drop down, it's telling you the actual text listed in the question. So for example, people always like to analyze should marijuana be made legal? So if you want to do that one, it's under civil liberties. But I'll choose favor or oppose the death penalty for murder for our example. And so now we've got a new table, dynamic visualization, and let's see what we can break down death penalty for murder by. Now, again, just to revisit the categories here, because you will use the predictor and outcome distinction when you're writing your lab report, the outcome variable is the variable listed up here. How else can we tell it's an outcome variable? Well, if you look at the variables, I mean, it's a sort of a logic process here where you could say, like in our previous example, I was supposing that health status, or condition of health rather, would predict number of children. And that makes sense to me, much, I suppose more so than the other way around, but they're only available one way around is the point I'm making too. So when you are in each trend category, you can see that there's all these outcome variables, and the outcome variables tend to be either a lot of them are opinion variables, because this is a social survey that's looking at attitudes and trends over time. And some of them have to do with lifestyle variables. And then the predictor variables tend to be, the predictor variables are all in the breakdown. And as you can see, there's just a limited number of predictors available. And these are standard predictors. As we discussed a bit when we talked about confounding and controlling for possible confounders, these predictors are also things that are often possible confounders. And you'll see that across the various trend categories, the predictors are, I think, all the same. So let's break down favor or oppose death penalty for murder by condition of health, since I did that before. Oh, but that's all over the board. It's good to choose not at random, but with some idea in mind for why do you expect there to be an interesting relationship between the predictor and the outcome variables that you've selected. So let me think for a minute, what would be an interesting relationship for favor or oppose death penalty for murder? Maybe, I know which one. Religion. Sex? Yeah, maybe sex. Let's view the breakdown. Oh, goodness. That's a good one. You can see there's a clear trend here that the males are clearly more males across time. More males are favor death penalty. How do I know that what I'm looking at are the rates for favoring the death penalty? Well, because in the question response category, I selected to just see the favor responses. So you can only see one outcome response at a time. In the case of a variable like this, which has basically two, I mean, there are three categories technically, but favor and oppose are the primary categories. So we're looking at favor right now. If we looked at oppose, we'll see that it's a basically inversion of the other graph, so that more females across time, females are more likely to oppose the death penalty. And even when the general trend across time went, like favoritism towards the death penalty went down generally, or wait, we're looking at oppose now. I'm going to switch back to looking at favor, but I just wanted to show you how the question response area works. So the trend across time, which this is the one that makes, I was going to say that seems wrong that favoring the death penalty went down in the 80s. It didn't. Generally speaking, we can see that from 1972, in comparison to 1972, the generally favoring the death penalty went up, you know, by 1985 or so, by the early 80s. In across sexes, both males and females, more of them tended to favor the death penalty. And then that favoritism for the death penalty more or less stayed stable until about 1995. And then generally the attitude towards favoring the death penalty declined. So you can see as we get to move from 2000 or from 1995 to 2015, there's a general trend of weaning support for favoring the death penalty. But the trend that we initially observed, which is that males were more likely to have a higher percentage of males favored the death penalty across time, holds up even when the overall attitudes towards death penalty change at, trend up or down. Does the observations that I'm making from this visualization seem clear? Are there any questions about how I have come to these conclusions based on our visualization? I'll give you a minute to think about it. Because in your lab, what you'll do with each of these is you'll select 4 key trends. So what we just did, and create a visualization for each trend. In addition to, I just went over the directions for creating the visualization. I provided a link here for you to a very, very nice help guide related to using the dynamic visualization tool. It's a very easy to follow help guide. So if you have any questions or if you feel at all confused when you're using this tool, go to this page, and it's very nicely laid out, very clear, lots of screenshots to guide you through. And then you can export your visualization for submission with your lab report. You'll export each visualization separately. As you can see, I can export it right here as a chart. The chart can be exported as a PDF. We also have the option of exporting the data in an Excel file. And that data, you can see those data if you switch from, see the chart and table button on the far right here. So I just switched between the table. So now I'm back to the chart, and I can look at the data in the table, the exact values in a spreadsheet format. across time for every year from 1972. You can see in 1994, they started doing the survey biannually instead of each year. At that point, they actually increased the sample size, so they get the same total number of people across each year, but do the administration in this biannual way. So same total number of people, but they get some better statistical capabilities by having some larger sample sizes at a slightly fewer, visit half as many time points, but still quite frequently. Every 2 years is pretty frequent. So I'm not requiring you to do anything with the data in the table today. That's what I removed from your lab report, but it's a good idea to at least take a look at it and just try to help to translate, try to think through a little bit, just give it a minute of thinking about how your visualization and then what it comparably looks like in the data set. So, but no need to, obsessively look at these data, but I just want you to start getting familiar with thinking about the both visualizing data in charts like this and looking at actual data, because we are going to be looking at increasingly larger data in that sense. So as you could see in the table, we were just looking at the cross tabulation. This is another concept we're going to be revisiting again. So I'm introducing this key term, cross tabulation, which is when you have two categorical variables and their data laid out like this in a cross format. So here I've got on the rows, they've put the sex variable, so the females go across the row and male. And then on the column, the year. And the data inside the cells are the measured, in this case, these are the percentages for each data point. But it's a cross tabulation of these percentages by sex and year of the percentage of participants. So technically, I would say this is a cross tabulation of the percentage of participants who favor the death penalty, broken down by sex and year. So just export your chart. You're going to export each of your 4 trend charts, because remember, you'll look at 4 key trends and see when it exports, it does it in this very nice format, which this is a really nice feature of using the Data Explorer, and something that makes it great for use in other applications. You might have different areas to apply this in work or future school work. And the nice thing about this versus the other ways we could analyze the GSS data is that in addition to the visualization, of course, looks nice, and NORC puts it together for us nicely, it also provides for us the a clear key to the variable levels and the citation. And a lot of times people forget to include citations for things like this, but it is very important. Just as it's important to include the citation for any information that you get from an article or a website, these data are also need to be cited. So this is how you cite it. You can and so the nice thing is when you're using these visualizations, it's already cited in there for you, very user friendly. So you'll end up with 4 of these. Yes, you'll just, I mean, if you have a program where you can combine them into one PDF, that's fine. If not, then you can upload each one to the, when you submit your lab report. Please name each file with the name of the variable, the outcome variable. So I just, where's the one? So when I download this one, I'll want to name it favor death penalty, and then we broke down by sex. Favor death penalty by sex. Okay, that way when I'm grading your reports, I'll be able to find the appropriate visualization to give you credit for it. So make sure the file is labeled as specified. In fact, I'm even going to add that to the assignment guide, and I'll upload a very slightly updated version of the assignment guide at the end of lab with that key information about variable naming, because it is important. Sometimes people submit files, or very often people submit files on Blackboard, and when you have multiple files in one submission, I really need them to have different names so I know what each file is. Otherwise, it's really cumbersome. Okay, so you'll end up with your 4 trends, and then, so now you've got 4 trends. Then what? Well, for each trend, you want to do the following steps. You'll first identify the outcome variable. In this case, an outcome variable was favoring the death penalty for murder. And what's the variable name? The variable name is the name of the core variable. So we're in here. This is the variable name. And these are also the variable names for the outcome variables, or for the predictor variables, excuse me. The variable label is this question. So they don't, I'm just curious if these longer ones show up. Oh, I guess even the longer ones show up, the whole thing in here. Well, that's very nice, the whole variable label. So technically, in terms of the GSS data set, what you're looking at, that I've just called variable name here, in the, when you download the data set offline, these are the variable labels. So that's why it's a little tricky. But go ahead and, as I said, fill in the variable name. Yeah, I'll take variable label out since I guess that doesn't apply. Then specify the values for each response category. So we didn't include oppose and don't know in our graph, but they're all 3 of these, favor, oppose, and don't know. Are each values for the response category. So there's 3 values for this variable. And then the level of measurement of the variable. This favor or oppose death penalty for murder is a nominal variable. I know it's a nominal variable because it's just categorical, and there's no ranking involved. And do the same steps for the predictor variable. Describe each of the same aspects of the variable. And then address item C here for the whole, for the visualization altogether. Did the trend change over time? Yes or no, and why do you think so? Make sure to use data from your visualization to support your response. What kinds of observations and responses could you provide in answering this question? Well, the sorts of observations I was making earlier when we were describing the trend over time. I'll add to this to help you out with a little guidance. Include the predictor variable. Use the predictor variable to help guide your description of the trend. That's the point of having the breakdown and having the predictor variable there. So do you have any questions? Are you alive out there? Everybody is so quiet. Okay, thanks. Just checking. So that's the lab. You're going to go through, do each of these steps, do your trends, put this all together in one, except for, of course, the trends. As I just specified, you have to upload your PDFs separately. I know that. But for your lab report, just I guess before we're done, let me help you out with that a little bit too. So how are you going to turn all this in? Well, for the first few steps, you're going to just, go through and do the activities. You'll review the pages, do the quiz, review the key trends, and then create your visualizations. And then when we get down to 6, you can you'll address each of these items in your lab report. Your lab report is it's a Word document where you put together this little report about your lab. Title it, put your name on the file, because if you do a fantastic job, I might want to use it in a future class as an example. So don't you want to be credited? Well, obviously I credit everybody, and I ask before I use your examples, but it is helpful to me if you include your name in the file name or on the file at least, but in the file name is most helpful actually. So if you name your file something like last name, like I will name my file, I'll show you by saving this file. Be best for me if you just name it your last name _ lab number report. This is the lab 1 report, right? It's the report for lab 1 or something very similar to this, but including your last name. Okay. So we've got a lab report, and and you want to do each of these for each trend. So in your report, you're going to have 4 sections. And for each section, you want to give it a heading. The heading is the name of your the key trend visualization. So the one I did was favor, death, Favor death penalty for murder. Breakdown by, okay, this is the heading of the section. And so in this section, you'll identify each of these, address each of these things. And for these answers that don't require sentences, they don't require sentences. You can just answer them. So identify the outcome variable. And, list it. Yes, this has the 48-hour forgiveness period. It shouldn't take too much time. I went through and did this. And of course, I account for the fact that it takes me, and I'm faster at doing this stuff. But I'm hoping it won't be too hard. So just go ahead and you'll have these, this section. This is the heading. So I'm going to bold my heading. So I'll identify the outcome variable that was now, as we discussed, technically it was favor or oppose death penalty for murder. So I'll change that. I just copied it over to minimize my typing. And then in this case, the variable name is the same as the outcome variable. The values for the response category we discussed are favor, oppose, and don't know. Just list them out. The level of measurement is nominal. And the predictor variable was sex. And again, the variable name sex, the values are male and female. The level of measurement of sex is a nominal variable. And then just answer the question, for this question, you would answer that in sentence format. But the rest of these, just go ahead and fill them in like that. And then you can do this whole thing 4 times. And it's, if I were you, I would suggest, I'll say this, I'd suggest doing it when you get to the point where you're creating, in the dynamic visualization feature. At that point, start to create your lab report like I have here. And then as you're going through and doing each visualization, while you're in the Data Explorer, you can answer these questions right along the way. And you might want to, when you're doing this last question, you might find it helpful to, you might explore a couple different ways of looking at it. Like, as you saw, when I was looking at this at first, we had favor and then oppose. And I said, well, I find it easiest to look at this variable using the favor category. So I switched back to that. But, you can play around a little bit with it before you settle on, okay, which is the question response and the breakdown that I can, that makes sense to me, that I can describe, most readily. Okay? Any questions? Would you like to review the levels of measurement? I think I will. I have it's, again, don't worry, but I have an extremely brief quiz of just a few questions where you can practice identifying levels of measurement. And I'll put that into, you can do it unlimited times, but it'll give you, it's only like a couple of questions, but it'll give you a little practice with identifying the level of measurement for some other variables, and then you'll be able to get some immediate feedback on the on it. Uh, Still, it's much shorter than the quiz I cut earlier. So the levels of measurement here, I already have a nice PowerPoint describing the topic. Because of the timing of everything, it's hard to get, I'm trying to get all of our topics synced up with the labs, but sometimes we're just a little bit ahead or behind, and that's okay. Because I'll always provide you with the information that is really essential. Here, while I'm finding this, you can enjoy this cute uh, sequence in the PowerPoint. This is in another one. It's funny. You can find pictures of squirrels doing just about anything. This is from my different, oh, here we go. I got it. Oh, well, this isn't very interesting PowerPoint, I suppose, because it's from another book we're not using, but that's okay. So we have 4 levels of measurement, or technically 4 levels of measurement, but only 3 that are of major interest in this class. We'll only really distinguish between the first 3. And at the nominal level, so we'll discuss them each in order of complexity. So at the nominal level, you have variables that are categorical. You've got numbers assigned according to a set of rules, and the numbers are just being used to classify or categorize. They place the cases into categories and then count the frequency of the occurrence of that category. So as you saw in the one we looked at earlier, our variables were nominal. Sex is a nominal variable. There's no hierarchy, but often you may already be familiar with the convention of males and females being assigned a number. So females might be 1, males might be 2, and those numbers, we know those numbers don't correspond to a hierarchy. They are just being used as a code. And that's a characteristic of a nominal level variable. And just to highlight, when a number is used to label a category, a quantity is not implied, it's just a code. Okay. Here's an example of a nominal variable. In this case, the variable was attitude toward Latinos, and it was categorized into prejudiced or tolerant. And they gave them each a number in the category, but the number is just used as a to organize the data. It's not meaningful in and of itself. And as you can see, 5 people were prejudiced towards Latinos and 5 people were tolerant. I see your question. So you should still try to get the chapter 4 homework done. I understand it might take some more time because we didn't get to the average and standard deviation. You don't have to have it in tomorrow. Remember, you still have a couple days after that. If you have trouble with it, I mean, we will cover the average and standard deviation on Tuesday. So it's fine if you need some more time, but don't let that, like if you get stuck on some problems in chapter 4, you can't wait then to read chapter 5. You've got to just keep going because we will get through that material by the end of the week. So if that makes sense, do your best with chapter 4. If you have questions, you can reach out to me over the weekend and I'd be happy to help you out. If there's a lot of interest, then I'll set up some virtual office hours over the weekend where we can address your questions about the chapter exercises in a format like this, where we'll go over them like we do in lecture. That's what I do generally in office hours, and record that. So let me know and if you have any trouble, but do try to get through it by Monday. Okay, so back to our levels of measurement. Have a nice weekend. Jolanda, you would like office hours. That's fine. We'll set up a time at the end of the session. Okay, we'll circle back to this. So we're almost done with this lecture. The ordinal level variables are when you've got cases ordered based on the degree of a certain characteristic. So the researcher has ranked the cases, and the nature of the relationship among the categories depends on the characteristic being measured. So this maybe sounds a little tricky. Let's look at a quick example of this in the GSS data set, because I remember that the next example, I mean, there's another example in here too, but there are some ordinal variables in the GSS in the data visualization tool. So the cases are ranked. The key aspect of the ordinal variable is that while there's a ranking among the cases, the magnitude of difference between the categories might not always be the same. Okay, and it's not possible to assign meaningful scores to cases located at points along the scale. So while numbers might be used to classify people organize people into groups based on an ordinal level variable, that again, similar to a nominal variable, is not to imply that the numbers assigned are inherently meaningful. So we can't use them to do more complicated analysis. They're just telling us this is the category, and it's giving us an order of the ranking. So for example, we can see in this table, we've got now our previous data of these 10 students and their attitudes towards Latinos. We now have them broken down by student. So you can see there's 10 students, and they've been ranked from most prejudice to least prejudice. But as you can see, the difference between the most prejudiced person and the second most prejudiced person, the difference in their amount of prejudice may not be the same amount of prejudice that distinguishes, say, the second person from the third person. And you can see this laid out. You'll see more clearly in our next example, but I'll skip ahead a little bit. So when we look at the interval data, we see their actual scores. And as you can see, it's what I described. There was only 2 points between the most prejudiced and the next most prejudiced person. But then at some point here, when we get between person 4 and person 5, there's a big gap of over 70 points of prejudice. So the difference between 1 and 2 is not the same as the amount of difference between 4 and 5. This is what characterizes an ordinal variable. And so finally, we have one more variable type to look at, interval and ratio level variables. They measure, so we're grouped together two variable types, interval and ratio. And for our purposes in this class, we can go back. Oh, sorry, I thought I was going to sneeze. So for our class, we can group them together, and you don't have to worry about the difference between these two categories. The key aspect of the interval variable, or both of these, is that the distance between the points is the same. So you can assign the variables on a unit of measure, and that unit of measure is constant. It doesn't change. The interval between the points isn't variable like it is in an ordinal. In an ordinal variable, it's always the same units. And just as a point of interest, although we will classify them together so that you're aware of the difference, the ratio level assumes has all the qualities of an interval variable, but it has an absolute 0 point, a true 0, like age in number of years, or like age period. Age has a true 0 point. You can't have a negative age. There's a clear point that's 0, and you can move from that. A variable that doesn't have that has an artificial 0 point would be like the temperature scale, like Fahrenheit. You can get to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, but there's it's arbitrarily more or less assigned. So there's there's a negative side, and I mean, technically most people, you would treat a temperature scale still as a ratio. Better example of an interval, although this distinction isn't, we're glossing over this distinction anyway this semester, so I guess it's not too important. But just to make it clear for the purpose of clarity, an artificial value, 0 value or none at all, an example of an interval variable like that might be one where someone was asked to say, on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being not at all, and 10 being all the time, how often do you, I don't know, take a nap during the day? Just, I wish I had time to do that. And so then there's if the variables is outlined correctly, then there would be an equal distance maybe between the points, and you can, that would be an example of an interval level variable that has no 0 point. So I hope that makes sense. An interval level variable has, we'll look at lots of interval level variables in this course. In our first lab, there's not too many interval variables in the data visualization tool, but when we do the average and standard deviation, those are measures that are only valid for interval level variables, and we'll use them a lot. We'll do a lot of analyses on interval level variables that are outcome variables. So it is, even though you won't use it too much in the lab this week, this is a really important distinction to understand, because as we move through the class, you'll need to classify variables based on these levels of measurement, and that will guide you in making other really important choices for what statistics you're going to do. So the interval, this is our interval data again, and I know we looked at this already for a moment, but as you can see, there's the difference is now we still have the same participants, but instead we've got their actual scores on what I assume a test at prejudice. We don't get a lot of information about what that is, but these are their actual scores. And you can see how they use some interval-based assignment. There's probably lots of questions on this test, and then their scores are quantified. So that's a little introduction to levels of measurement. Any questions about it? Okay, well, it sounds like everybody feels really good about this lab. I'm happy to see that. Make sure to download the updated lab guide. I will update it in the next, 10 minutes or so. I'll go in right away and just update the file in Blackboard. That is this file here, the Lab 1 guide, with the very slight modification. Remember, we took out a couple of these categories to describe, and we're going to complete this brief quiz on levels of measurement to get you just a little bit of practice classifying them, and so you can get some immediate feedback before you have to classify it, and which is worth a lot more points. Okay. Good luck with the lab. I hope that you enjoy it. And if you have any difficulties, as always, feel free to, if you get stuck, reach out. I'll save you. All right, everybody. Good luck. And remember, for the most efficient way, do some stats every day.